All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Joel Rosen, and I'm here joined with Dr. John Thomas, and we are going to start to lead a Q&A for Kurt's MTHFR epigenetic group. And Kurt wanted me to let you guys know that he's been taking a leave of absence because of his father's passing here down in Florida. And him and I tried to get a Q&A started the other day, but Facebook was slightly down. And so now we are going to supply you guys with a lot of information, because chances are, if you're in this group, it's either for yourself or a loved one. You're suffering with a chronic condition where it's exhaustion or fatigue or brain fog or feeling overwhelmed. Maybe you're not balancing your hormones, or you have a thyroid disorder, or maybe you have a child who's on the autism spectrum and you're depressed, you're anxious, you're overwhelmed, you're taking medications, and you know of this thing called MTHFR, and that there's something there that you need more information for. And that's what this group has been for. This group is a public service group for you to get information. And what happens is, when you start to go down that rabbit hole of what is MTHFR, a lot of the times you're left with way more questions than you even started with. Like, what's wrong with me? Or what can I do to help myself? Or how are these genetics involved? Or what supplements do I take now? Should I take this B vitamin or that B vitamin? And based on my genetics, what should I do in way of testing? Or where do I go from here? And what does it all mean? And what should I do? So really understanding that there's more to the MTHFR story is really why we want to support you guys with Q&As. And I'm here now with Dr. John Thomas, who's really an expert in natural medicine and clinical nutrigenomics. He's been working with patients for years in this field. And John, why don't you introduce yourself to us?
Hi. Yeah, thanks for having me on this. And I know that you've been chatting with Kurt, and there was a bunch of questions that came in that we wanted to make sure we kind of get the proper answers to that as a starting point. But yeah, I have a practice that focuses and specializes in interpreting genetics and taking that information and correlating it to someone's chronic health issues, abnormal laboratory components that may give a lot of insight into why they're suffering and why they're not recovering. Whether it be adults with, a laundry list of issues, fatigue, hormone components, or kids, on the spectrum. So this is what I do day in, day out. And so I'm pleased to be here to help out and get some answers to these questions everybody has, and go from there.
Awesome. So what I did, John, was I ended up putting the questions down that were the most asked questions in the group, and we'll start the process of just getting these questions answers right away. So one of the questions we have here is, I have an MTHFR double mutation. What's the first thing that I should do? Because I want to detox my body, and I want to know what the best way is. So it seems like there's a two-part question there, John. I have an MTHFR double mutation. What's the first thing that I should do? Because I want to be able to detox effectively.
Right. So this is a very common question. I get a lot of people when they first come to me, it's because another doctor has ran genetic testing and they tested MTHFR on them, and they come back with, compound heterozygous. They come back with 2 mutations of 677 location, or 2 mutations of 1298 mutation, and they don't know where to start because their doctor doesn't really know where to start as well. And that's a reoccurring thing that we hear is, my doctor's not an expert in this, or doesn't know what to do about it, or they prescribe them Deplin, or just tell them to increase their folic acid intake. But realistically, the first thing that somebody's got to do is, if you're really trying to figure out how your genetic predisposition may be playing into this, is you need to do full genetic testing without a doubt, okay? If you're trying to kind of play on this field and say, all right, there's a genetic component to why I feel XYZ way, or this XYZ diagnosis, and you're trying to make decisions based on a MTHFR double mutation alone, kind of an injustice. Now, don't get me wrong. Some people, the biggest priority in this is MTHFR, and they take methylfolate, they get the folic acid out of their diet, and it's like the lights come on, okay? But that's far and few between where that happens. There's so many other pieces of this. There's so many other bigger players. So the first thing I always recommend patients to do is, you've got to do full genetic testing, especially if you're talking about, hey, I want to get in and start detoxing my body. whether detoxing, detoxing chemicals or speeding up how our liver functions or detoxing heavy metals. You're kind of playing with fire, because if you have bigger issues genetically in your sulfuration pathways, dealing with like glutathione metabolism and glutathione recycling, you may just pull metals or pull chemicals and just reabsorb them and not get very much out of it, or worst case scenario, do more harm. So really, you gotta know the whole genetic picture. And I know, Joel, I've told you this analogy over and over many times. You hear me say this. It's like taking the Harry Potter series of books. Okay, I've got 2 kids that are 11 and 13, so they're kind of getting into that stuff. And it's like reading page 1 of the first book. Page 1 tells you you have a double mutation of an MTHFR gene. And then what you say is, I'm going to close this book up. I don't need to read the rest of this book. I don't need to read the rest of the series. I know exactly how this all is going to end. It's a complete injustice. And it's going in blind, and it's like throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. So really, if somebody really wants to figure out how their genetics play into it, they have to do full genetic testing. And then from there, full genetic testing is going to give you rabbit holes or rocks to turn under to really steer you into what labs maybe you need to do. So if you have a lot of issues with solute transport carriers in terms of how you can take iron from the gut to the bloodstream, or iron from outside the cell to inside the cell, that tells you, hey, you got to investigate the iron story a little bit more. If you got problems with glutathione, you got to investigate glutathione markers and your reduced and oxidized glutathione levels to figure out how do you address that piece of it. And if it strictly is an MTHFR issue, then you can do blood testing to look at your methylation and your methionine cycle, or look at your folate derivatives to figure out, okay, what do you really need to push in terms of folate metabolism to really get things going in the right direction?
Okay, awesome. So just to summarize that, so basically the question is, what do I do? I have this MTHFR double mutation. And really your answer, John, is before you start to put all your eggs in that basket, get a full genetic profile and start to understand what the priority is in all the things that those possible genes besides MTHFR tells you. And that's really what you're saying. So as far as just, I'm going to skip the second question and we'll come back to it in a second, is the third question is, where do I get these genetic tests from? What kit do you recommend the best? Which kits won't sell our results to drug companies? Or is there a concern, I'm adding this on there, in terms of privacy? And then also, is it super expensive? So basically, where do I get this done if you're recommending for me, okay, pump the brakes, don't necessarily get overwhelmed with a double mutated MTHFR, go get a complete genetic test done? Where do I do that and not be concerned about it being too expensive and or it's using my information in a bad way?
Yeah, and that's a big concern. I hear that pretty much every week from somebody, because the 2 things that are out there from a testing standpoint is using things like 23andMe or Ancestry.com. But the thing is there's fear there, because they are selling information and they're going to continue to do that. They're selling it to pharmaceutical companies for research. They are possibly, there's thoughts that insurance companies are going to be able to get that information and flag you with pre-existing health conditions as this whole genetic world evolves more. This genetic science evolves more. So there is concerns there, and then plus with that, a couple of years ago, 23andMe changed their gene card. They just went from version 4 to version 5. And they knocked thousands and thousands of genes off that gene card to compete with Ancestry from a price point, because they said, all right, we don't really care as much about the raw genetic data. Let's kind of put that focus more into some basic health reports and more of the focus into the Ancestry component, because that's what Ancestry is doing. So they wanted to kind of, capture more equivalent market share based on that. So with that, there's been newer genetic tests that have come out, which kind of take some of those concerns and put them to bed per se. Now, if you want to use Ancestry or 23andMe, there's ways to do it. You can use an alias, because there's no specific confirmative components that they use. Now, realize when you do that, there's going to be some restrictions and some Ancestry things if you want to go down that pathway. But if you're looking at that information for strictly the raw data to assess genes like MTHFR and other players in this, you can still use 23andMe and Ancestry, use the alias component, but then there's still some concerns with that they may come back and be able to track you. But there are some new tests out there, and some of these tests are created by practitioners like myself. I don't have a genetic test, but I have colleagues that have created tests out there that are very comprehensive, that contain all the information in Ancestry and 23andMe, plus so much more, because we're using it for research purposes on our end in terms of dealing with chronic health issues. And with this, a lot of the compliance components there, because really everything's pinned back to not so much like a name or a birth date or whatever. It's basically all barcode related. So there's a lot more control and privacy aspects with that. And like I said, we as practitioners understand those concerns that people have. And so there is no interest in selling information to pharmaceutical companies, because we're looking at this from a nutritional perspective. So it's kind of two different schools of thoughts in itself. But there are tests out there, like the functional genetic analysis test is a very comprehensive test, in my opinion, probably the most comprehensive one out there. But there's a handful of other ones, and most of these tests that are out there are maybe $350 to $99, and they just based on the amount of information, and realize the more information on gene card, the test is going to be up. So for a couple $100, $200 to $300, you could probably get a more thorough genetic test than what's available through 23andMe or Ancestry, and take away some of the fears with drug companies or insurance companies or third parties, buying that information, because there's more quality control on that with some of these newer platforms that have come out in the last year and a half.
What was the name, John, of that new one that you were recommending, so we could post that in the link? I'm sure Kurt would appreciate that as well, to give these people some insights if they don't have it already. What is the name of that one?
Yeah, it's a functional genomic analysis through methygenetic software or DNA supplementation. There's a really good site, Get to Know Your DNA, that is kind of a platform practitioner components, because this is a test that unfortunately the public just can't buy on their own. You've got to go through a healthcare practitioner. We are working right now on some sites that could be available for people that can buy it directly and get the reports, but that's still a little bit a ways away. But then you can, like I said, you can be able to get this, test through practitioner components that is going to take away some of those concerns, and then also possibly give you a helping hand. But like I said, we are shortly coming out with the ability to possibly be able to get that on your own. And when that is available, we can post that link in this Facebook group. So if people are interested to test genetics beyond MTHFR, they're going to have that access to just order the test on their own, and then be able to get a report of all this genetic data organized a few weeks to months later, just like it would be with 23andMe. The only difference is it's not going to provide the ancestry component. We are all about how the body functions, enzymatic activity. So it's basically all this data that tells how your biochemistry works. It doesn't give you anything regarding the ancestry aspect.
Yeah, it's usually the other way around. I tell people, because a lot of people don't realize, John, I'm sure you've seen this too, is they're sitting on a whole bunch of information. They don't even know it's there. They said, oh, I did a DNA test. I found out about my family, but do you think I'd be able to find out about my raw data? And I'm like, yeah, actually, I wish I had the money to put together after the commercial where it shows, find out about your family history, and then have a commercial that comes on right away and says, and after you're done with that information, there's this whole other raw data piece of information that will explain why there's autoimmunities in your family, or there's anxiety and depressions, or heart diseases tendencies in your family. So basically, for a lot of people that are listening, if you've done an ancestry test to find out about your family history, then you have that raw data there. And it just needs to be re-uploaded, or you need to extract the file, and that's really easy to do. So that's another insight for you guys as well. So John, another question we have on here is, what specific blood test should I have when I have a homozygous C677T other than homocysteine?
So it kind of ties back a little bit into the first thing we talked about full genetic aspects, because that's going to give insight into testing you need to do beyond the MTHFR, but specifically with an MTHFR heterozygous or homozygous, compounded mutation, you possibly want to run folate derivatives to look at what's going on with folate, folinic acid, and the list can go on and on from that standpoint. But you can also look at, besides homocysteine, you can look at SAMe levels. You can look at amino acids like methionine levels. And some of these markers are going to give you insight into how your methionine or methylation pathway is working and how relevant that MTHFR mutation may be. Because if you have a homozygous 677 MTHFR mutation and you run a methionine panel, and all those markers are on par, it gives insight that, hey, methylation is working properly, and then it drives home, hey, there's other pieces, there's bigger fish in this genetic puzzle or this genetic sea that you have to look at, and it's not MTHFR that is possibly driving a lot of these, chronic symptoms you're experiencing. But there's labs out there like Doctors Data. They have a methylation pathway test, which looks at cysteine, methionine, homocysteine, SAM and SAW levels. And they also have a test that looks at these folate derivatives. And those tests are pretty cost effective to do, to give you more insight into how clinically relevant is that MTHFR in the first place.
Yeah, and I would even just add on to that too, is that just other inflammatory markers from your basic blood work, assessing your stress quotients or having questionnaires that impact your stressors, looking at your immune system, because these are things that are going to impact the genetics as well. So John, there's another one is, can anyone share where to begin? Is there a list of knowledgeable doctors? I've not been tested yet, but I would love to find a doctor who's familiar with this test so that I know where to go and what could you recommend? So what kind of resources are out there for people that are looking for doctors in the know?
Yeah, there's a handful out there. And most people, like I said, this is what I do from a genetic standpoint. And so a lot of people find me through some of these resources. Sometimes it's Facebook forums like this where other people say, hey, this guy knows how to, interpret that aspect. But, Seeking Health, Dr. Ben Lynch's, websites, he's got practitioner referral sources there for people that have gone through some of his coursework or training, or they're kind of well, educated in this whole MTHFR nutritional genetic world. There's other websites out there as well. Get to know your DNA that ties into that functional genomic analysis. They have a practitioner, a resource. There's a lot of some of the interpretation sites out there, like LiveWello, which is something that I use for some of my customized templates. They have practitioner directories on there as well. And so, you can go on any of those practitioner directories and, read the practitioner's bio, shoot them an email, call their office and find out, ask them the questions if this is something that they do or is this just something they dabble in. Because, I'm fortunate I get to teach doctors as well how to implement this into their practice for certain supplement companies and certain lab companies. And one of the biggest things I hear from practitioners is they just don't have the time to learn this. So when you, as a practitioner, do genetic interpretation, genetic analysis, and really help people with a primary focus of this nutrigenomic, kind of discipline that we use in this, somebody's got to be all in. You just can't dabble in it and just test MTHFR on a couple things, because then you miss the big picture. You miss that 30,000-foot view. So there's resources out there to look at how extensive a practitioner's had training in this, and then email or ask them the questions to figure out, is this something that they do on an ongoing basis? And one thing I know I've told you, Joel, a lot is I've sat down with many patients and they say to me, thank you. Finally, somebody that knows more than me, because they've maybe gone to a few doctors that have just dabbled in this and had some frustration, because they start asking some of these questions about, hey, besides homocysteine, what other labs should I run? And it's like, well, we don't know, it's not something we do. So, those are some of the questions that people are asking these forums are the questions that ask a doctor, that they're possibly considering working with on these forums. And if they can get the answer to 90% of those questions, then that doctor is going to be pretty well, educated, invested in really getting in and interpreting genetics the way it needs to be done.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, John. I get people from around the world too with Dr. Lynch's directory, and they said, oh, we found you because we saw that you were one of the guys that had the most, credentials and courses that you've taken from Dr. Lynch. And I'm like, yeah, that just means I'm one of the bigger nerds of the bunch, and I've taken more of the courses. But the other thing I would say too is that we've put together a list of different questions to ask your doctor. And I think in those questions, we should also have a little asterisk beside it, just sort of for a bonus for people to, hey, ask these litmus test questions of your doctor, because if they don't know the answer to this question, then potentially this is a doctor who may not be completely fully invested and may be dabbling a little bit too. So let's make sure we do that when we put that together. The last question on here, John, is this is a little more complex. So I know that this Facebook forum has a dichotomy of people that are just learning and just heard about MTHFR to those that probably ask this specific question that are really down deep in the rabbit hole, and they're really, you can tell they're by the question that they're just overwhelmed and not really sure which way to go. So I threw this in there. I'm supposed to avoid methyl donors and methyl B12 because of COMT and a VDR gene. But for MTHFR, I'm supposed to encourage L-methylfolate and vitamin B12 for MTRR, and I'm supposed to encourage methyl B12 and methylfolate. Needless to say, I'm thoroughly confused as to what should I take. Can someone shed some light? So basically, I was told for this SNP not do this, but I was told for this other SNP to do this, and the two are completely opposed to each other. So what do you recommend for someone in that instance?
Yeah, I hear that a lot because, and that's where people kind of get into, all right, it's more than MTHFR. Now I've got these sea of altered genes. Where do I start? What's the next steps? What do I take? And there's a lot of confusion out there about this. But if we're talking, specifically with this question in terms of some of the genes, and the way I explain this is there's genes that code for enzymes on the front end, and there's things on the back end. And we're talking about MTHFR and MTRR, methionine synthase reductase, that deals with recycling B12. And that's what that MTRR does, which says, okay, if somebody's got genetic issues with the MTHFR and genetic issues with the MTRR, there may be more of a need or more of a demand for methylated B vitamins and maybe put in it at higher doses. But then the thing is if they've got genetic issues on the back end with like a COMT, catecholamine methyltransferase, which is responsible for breaking down things like dopamine and adrenaline. You start taking too many B vitamins, you're going to make too many excitatory chemicals faster and break them down, which may blow you out of the water, may ramp up anxiety, insomnia, things of that nature. So where do you start? So sometimes, knowing the whole genetic picture is beneficial, but sometimes it creates more confusion. And so what we want to do is help people understand, how do you do this? How do you start? What are the starting points? Laboratory components can help you with this. Homocysteine levels can be very beneficial to give you insight into how you're methylating. If your homocysteine levels are, double digits, yes, maybe there is more of a need for, B12. But there's other things. You can look at, whole blood histamine levels to determine if you're an under or over methylator, which can give you insight in this. But sometimes simply you just got to test it. Sometimes if you've got a homozygous 677 MTHFR and you've got a homozygous, COMT Valmet, then what happens, you just maybe got to choose what to do. When we're talking about methyl donors, you could take some methylfolate and B12 and then increase the dosage every day. See how your body responds. And if it blows you out of the water, you maybe lost that day. Or you could take some flushing niacin to clear out those methyl donors. And if you're concerned about, hey, maybe I have too many methyl donors and I've got symptoms of insomnia, anxiety, OCD tendencies, maybe you don't want to start with the methylated Bs. Maybe you want to start with maybe clearing out those methyl donors. And simply you could take some flushing-based niacin. That's going to help clear out some of those excess methyl donors. And if you feel better taking niacin, or if you feel better taking the B vitamins, that may give you insight in where to start. Now, it's more complex than this. But sometimes that's a good starting point to figure out, can I tolerate taking these methylated B vitamins in the first place? Take them, push the dosage, see how you do. If you become overstimulated, maybe it's not the starting point. Maybe if you go into this with symptoms of being overstimulated, don't start with the methylated B vitamins. Maybe start with some niacin to see, does that take the edge off, which will kind of give you that quick answer to that.
Yeah, and I think it points to a good distinction, John, that really like putting all of these questions together is A, you need a full methyl profile. B, you need to understand what are you coming in with, like what's not working with your health. It's not just, okay, I know there's a genetic thing. I mean, we want to be able to basically get a starting point on the roadmap. Okay, I'm dealing with focus, concentration, I'm not sleeping, I have excess weight gain, I turned on my autoimmune, so I'm dealing with Hashimoto, thyroid antibodies, and really, get a stock of what it is that we're trying to quantify objectively, but what is it that we're feeling subjectively, and then really start to put a profile together as to why these genes aren't working potentially properly, like what your susceptibilities are, and then really start to prioritize what's the most important thing to do in order to go forward. So that's what we've done, John, and what I'll do is I'll let the listeners know that I've told Kurt that we will definitely do a weekly Q&A. So what I want you guys to do is after you watch this, think about what questions you have and post it in this form so that we can do this, maybe even not wait till next Sunday, but we can do it during the week as well and answer your pressing questions. But also just want to let you know that we understand that there's a lot of you guys out there that are just overwhelmed and are really close. I mean, so close yet so far from really breaking this wide open and unlocking the mystery and seeing the improvements. And we realize this. What we've done is we've put together an MTHFR course. John, why don't you just let us know a little bit about what that is, and then I'll let the listeners be able to check it out themselves.
So, we put together an MTHFR crash course, and basically what it's designed is to allow people to get a better understanding of a lot of the things we talked about here so far in just these 5 questions in terms of, how to look beyond MTHFR on what are the other key genes that are players that possibly drive, chronic health issues, on why people aren't recovering, and beyond that, then saying, all right, hey, this is somebody's genetic predisposition. Now, what do they do about it? What are the supplements they should take? What are the supplements they shouldn't take? What's maybe the right dietary plan that they need to do? What are some of these additional lab tests besides the things we talked about today in terms of methylation, pathway tests and folates, based on some of these genetic predispositions, some of these key genes that they may have besides the MTHFR, genetic mutations? What are those next steps that they need to supplement, eat properly for, test more thoroughly so that they can gain control back on their own, okay? And then from there, if they are working with a healthcare practitioner, then what are the questions that they need to be asking a healthcare practitioner? So basically, it's a course that we kind of designed that takes this MTHFR and this whole genetic picture and expands on that and takes it down rabbit holes that people don't even know that are there. And it's going to really kind of create a mindset of, hey, we're kind of looking down the wrong holes, from the standpoint, and there's bigger pieces of this that we had no idea that were players here. We give people kind of the know-how to be able to take some of this back, on their own and start kind of putting those pieces back together to get things going in the right direction for them.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because we called it the MTHFR crash course, but like you said, it goes so much deeper than MTHFR, and it really is a paradigm shift. It's talking about basics, it's talking about stressors, it's talking about epigenetics, like Kurt called the name of this particular Facebook group, because he's absolutely right. It's the perfect storm of having the susceptibilities genetically with having the environmental pathogens and toxins and stressors that create the perfect storm. And we're here to navigate you through these rough waters. So it's not just asking the question, what's the best supplement to take for MTHFR? It's asking the questions, what's my first step? And then once I get that going, what's my next step? And then once I get that going, what do I do from there? And next thing you know, you've put together a couple of great protocols that are customized to yourself, and you're seeing the improvement. So super excited to offer this, John. Thanks for doing this today, and we'll make sure you guys put your questions in the comment section of this. And once again, Kurt does apologize apologize. He wasn't able to be on here today. Like I said, he had to take some time off to care for his family and be there for the passing of his father. So, but we will definitely make sure that we give you guys support, and we look forward to ending your MTHFR nightmare. Thanks so much for being here, John.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Joel.